The year was 1990, and my wife and I were having our annual debate about where to go on vacation. It's called submission. That discussion was resolved when I received a letter from the very Reverend John Peterson, Dean of St. George's College in Jerusalem. John is an old friend when he was head of the College of Preachers at the National Cathedral. He was inviting me to come participate in a course at St. George's, a course entitled The Palestine of Jesus. Essentially, we would walk from Upper Galilee to Jerusalem. Actually, it was by bus stop and bus stop. St. George's is the Anglicans' communion for continuing education for the entire Middle East, if not all of Europe. Students come from all over the world. He was inviting me to come and be a part of a course they were introducing called The Palestine of Jesus. Essentially, we would be using the Gospel of Luke. We would be starting our journey in Upper Palestine and traveling most of the way into Jerusalem over a period of 2 weeks. When I read through the Gospel for today, it was as though I was being transported in time back to that course and that journey, because I remember vividly leaving the bus parked below the mountain and walking up the hill to the top, to the city of Jerusalem, the ruins, to see what was once one of the 7 wonders of the world. The temple is not only the seat, but the heart of Judaism. Originally built by Solomon in the 10th century, destroyed by the Babylonians in the 6th century, rebuilt 70 years later, and ultimately destroyed by the Roman legions in 70 A.D. In the Gospel for this morning, the disciples are overwhelmed by what they see of the stones. It's like white marble. I mean, it's not quite marble. Mined from the hills surrounding Jerusalem. And what's left of the temple is in the ruins. All that is there standing is the west wall. Pilgrims come from all over the world just as we came there. In the Gospel for this morning, Jesus' disciples are impressed by that city that was then standing, gorgeous, reverent in nature. They comment particularly about the stones. You have to understand that those buildings were made out of the mined stones, most of which are 8 feet long, 4 feet high, and 4 feet wide. My wife stood on one of them and walked across it. It took her 2.5 steps to cover from one side to the other. It gives you some sense of the enormity of the stones for both the buildings and the walls. And the disciples say to Jesus, "Just look how magnificent it is." And his reply is, "Not one stone will be left standing on another." Ultimately, the city would be destroyed, the temple left in ruins, the left west wall left standing, although badly scarred. And to this day, people come from all over the world just as we came to pray at that wall, to write the names of loved one they want to remember, fold the paper and stick it in the cracks in the wall. It is a solemn place. It is quiet. A magnificent structure. I keep a piece of one of those stones as a reminder of that trip. It reminds me that we live in a world that is always transitory. That of magnificent structures today are rubble for tomorrow. And it seems to me that one of the ultimate questions that you and I ask in some form or another is, how do we live with hope in a world in which kingdoms come and go and uncertainty is a part of daily existence? How do we live in that kind of a world with hope? How do we live in that kind of transitory world with some sense of well-being? How do we live in the world we live in without being terribly depressed? A world in which ultimately one stone will not be left on another. Seems to me that Jesus anticipated that question from those who stood there marveling at the stones and the structures. But then he goes on to assure them that even as one stone will not be left on another, God's Spirit will remain among them. As though he's saying to them, the one thing you have to hold on to for hope is that you belong. You belong to the one who has created all this. We come this Sunday as the next to last Sunday in our church year. Our church year begins in Advent, goes through Christmas, Epiphany, Lent, Easter, all those Sundays afterwards, and we repeat it every year. So next Sunday will be the last Sunday in year C of our 3-year cycle. Next Sunday we call Christ the King Sunday. That there is a King that we worship who is over and above all of those stones lying strewn across the face of the planet. How do you live in that kind of world? How do you live with affirmation without becoming depressed? How do you live with the reality that this is God's world and each of us is precious in God's sight? I've told this story before, and I will tell it again and again and again because I love it. It's a true story. My friend Harry Pritchard was rector of All Saints Church in Atlanta for many years. Grew up in Alabama. There was a story of when his daughter was very young. There was a terrible storm one night. She was in her room, in her bed, became terrified of the thunder and the lightning and began screaming and crying. His wife got up and went to the room, reassured her and said, "Honey, God is watching over you." Little girl's reply is, "I want somebody with flesh on." And that's what we got. That's what we got. Somebody with flesh on. So it is that next Sunday is Christ the King Sunday. The one who came among us with flesh on. In our second lesson for this morning, Paul is writing to the little church in Thessaloniki. It seems that some thought the end of the world was near, so they quit working. Decided it was more fun just to hang out. I think I know some of them. Paul writes to them, and he says, "Get your behinds back to work." Get your behinds back to work, but by your endurance you will gain your souls. Is every morning getting up with the hope about not only who we are, but whose we are. That's the hope that gets us through the day and through the night of the storms. That thought is phrased another way by Martin Luther King, Jr. The night before he died, standing on the balcony of his hotel room in Memphis, addressing some of his followers and the press. Things were changing. The whole movement was changing. To some extent, the future was ahead, but the future was uncertain. Speaking of his own life, he said that he was assured because he had glimpsed the promised land. Listen to what he says. "I don't know what will happen now. We have difficult days ahead. But it doesn't matter with me now, because I've been to the mountaintop. And I don't mind, I just want to do God's will." And He's allowed me to go up to the mountain. I've looked over, and I've seen the promised land. I may not get there with you, but I want you to know tonight that we as a people will get to the promised land. And I'm happy tonight. I'm not worried about anything. I'm not fearing any man. Mine eyes have seen the glory of the coming of the Lord. Hold on to that, and it might just get you through the night.